to Real Talk about the status of DEI in journalism. Please welcome to the stage O&A Learning Director, Kelsey Proud.
Good morning. Do you remember the first time you heard the term DEI? I'll bet the answer really differs depending on who you are. Was it an all-hands meeting at work? Were citizens regularly protesting in the streets? How soon after that were you required to take a DEI training course? To literally check a box? Did your company hire a chief diversity officer? Were they given a team, a usable budget? Are they still in their role? Do they have power? Did your company write a statement on diversity and release it to the public? What has happened to all of these initiatives now? What opportunities are we missing as an industry? What decisions need to be made? There is not only a human case for inclusion, but a clear and urgent business case. DEI is more than a corporate buzzword. We will meet this moment? ? What happens and who is hurt when the industry falls short or fails in this way? What gets cut first when budgets get tight? We have the good fortune of having sort of a super session today, focused on these questions and more. And, of course, you'll have questions. So please remind all of you that you can submit your live questions for the panel on the session description on the O&A 23 website and app. First, we welcome our panel for robust discussion and reflections on their own experiences. Then, at 12:30, we will welcome Nicole Hannah-Jones to this stage for a fireside conversation. So stay in the room, stay in the stream, and it's going to be an essential hour and a half. Now I'd love to introduce our amazing panel of experts in this area. Kathleen McElroy of the University of Texas at Austin, Lenore Ayala-Pauly of URL Media, Martin G. Reynolds of the Robert C. Maynard Institute for Journalism Education, and our moderator today is Versha Sharma of Teen Vogue. Thank you all.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Kelsey, and thank you all for joining us. Kelsey kind of already did this with her very, very essential opening questions, but this is, how I want to start is painting a more vivid picture of how we were all feeling in 2020. So it's May 2020. We're 2 months into the pandemic. Video of the murder of George Floyd is spreading online, and protests are starting. Then they're spreading, first throughout the country, then throughout the world. Everyone is talking about racial justice and the lack of it. Every industry is taking stock of their own shortcomings. DEI positions are created at multiple companies. Newsrooms are looking at their own mastheads for the first time, in some cases, ever in this lens. And the people, like yourselves, who have been banging this drum all along are finally being heard. Promises are made to do better, percentages, quotas, pledges. Fast forward to here today, August 2023 in Philadelphia. What is one word that you would use to describe the current status of DEI in journalism? Martin, I'm going to start with you.
Retrenchment. demoralizing.
And I mispronounced this word. It was on my GRE, even though it's been around a long time, inchoate, that it's still at a beginning and it hasn't really been fully formed.
Yes. All great options for this question. Now, the three of you are not new to this. In fact, you've been working for many, many years toward establishing racial equity in journalism. Supposedly. How did you feel in 2020 when all of these promises were being made, and then how are you feeling now? Let's elaborate on your choices.
In 2020, I mean, obviously what emerged out of such a tragic moment was also incredibly inspirational. People talked about it being a racial reckoning. I would say for some, perhaps it was an awakening, and there seemed to be a common view, in large part because of this mix of pandemic and folks being sort of shut in, that there was this sort of collective opportunity to see this horror that many of us have known had existed for so long. And so it felt good that others were seeing what we have been seeing and navigating. That was powerful, that was profound, that was deeply touching. And it was also incredibly frustrating at the same time, because it's in many ways, I mean, I look at it, just taking it personally, is like, well, how come you haven't known this the entire time?
Plus one to what Martin's saying. I had been working in this space since about, for most of all of my career, and then was formally given the title in 2018. And so when 2020 rolled around and you know, it was hard, you know, it was this conflicting emotion of like this really tragic event that should not have happened is now catapulting diversity, equity, and inclusion into the spotlight. So it was very, you know, conflicting emotions about how, you know, this work that a lot of us have been doing for a long time is suddenly everyone was paying attention to. So there was a lot of good things to come out of that. So it was like, you know, that morning, at the same time trying to put my head on and say, all right, this is our moment to really make sure this work is not taken for granted anymore. So it was exhilarating to be in the spotlight. We, you know, in my role, it's my former role, we seized the moment, and we had really tough conversations in our newsroom. We were really self-reflective for the first time, which was a good thing to come out of it. And people were part of the conversation. I left that role and joined URL Media, where I'm continuing to advance that work. So to be in this moment where we've seen this retrenchment, huge retrenchment, it is demoralizing. At the same time, I want to find the silver lining of like when we come back to a moment where people realize that this is about building workplaces that are thriving, where everyone feels like they belong and that they have a story to tell. So there is hope, and I'll turn it over to Kathleen because I'm sure she has a lot to say.
No, I'm gaining as much from this as anyone else. But you know, a couple of things. I remember after George Floyd and some other murders that someone said, "Ooh," on what used to be known as Twitter, just when you thought COVID was ahead in the count, racism comes in and it's taken the lead. And someone tweeted back, "No, you got it wrong. COVID, it was the visiting team. Racism is the home team." And I thought that was really insightful. Mm-hmm. But in terms of journalism, I actually did a case study for a center I work for, the Center for Ethical Leadership in Media. And what's interesting is that as journalists got beaten up by cops, they said, "Wait a second, there's something wrong here." Mm-hmm. And in the course of 1 week, in June 2020, there were newsrooms upheavals here in Philadelphia, at the New York Times, at all these places. It's like journalists were saying, especially journalists of color, are like, wait a second, we're being affected by all of this, and we're not being supported. And we have a voice in our newsroom that goes beyond, we're just going to quote unquote report the news and let's see what happens. So I was really fascinated by how newsrooms sort of in a way, I don't want to call it a mutiny, but sort of said, wait a second, we need more voice of what's going on here.
Now, what followed was a slew of appointments and hires, and I myself was part of this new leadership wave. About a year later, May 2021, I was announced as the new editor-in-chief of Teen Vogue. There are so many other women of color taking leadership positions of newsrooms at that time as well. These trend pieces were written in the New York Times and Variety, even Hollywood Reporter. But one thing that we have been talking about is, okay, it's one thing to hire somebody to these positions. How do you actually set them up for success? And I know that all of you have done a lot of work in this space, but Martin, I want to start with you because I know you have intimate knowledge of what that means.
Well, at the Maynard Institute, we are the oldest national nonprofit dedicating to helping America's newsrooms reflect the diversity of the nation. And when 2020 happened, and the calls for dismantling systemic racism in news emerged in building anti-racist newsrooms, which was also powerful because in many ways we were not using that language. And as we were talking about naming what it truly is and using the language and addressing what actually needs to be unwound is incredibly powerful. And at that time, we as an organization were reflecting on, well, what ought the aspiration be? I mean, we're journalists about journalism for journalism, and so we wanted to think about what should we be pointing to and then thinking about the programming that we needed to develop to be in service of that. And in talking with folks in philanthropy and with folks through community organizers and activists, this elegant notion of belonging emerged. And not that we came up with that, it's been in other sectors for quite some time, but it certainly hadn't been in journalism to the way that it is now. And in thinking about what kind of programming could happen to create journalistic institutions of belonging, we do fault lines training, which focuses on race and class and gender and generation geography, and how you align across those social fault lines shapes perception. But the reality is a short training in an organization is not going to be transformative enough. And so we wanted to come with something that was a much deeper engagement, because the reality is, and we ask people all the time, and now we do, is, well, why does diversity matter to you? Because the reality is, for folks often in this room who come to these kinds of sessions, there's a relationship to it. For many of our friends and colleagues in these places and in positions of power, there isn't necessarily. And if you can't, and as journalists, we so often want to focus on the organization, the coverage, the work, the product, but in fact, we are all showing up with deeply conditioned ways of thinking. And until we actually get personal with what needs to change within me in order to make this place hospitable and welcoming for all, then we are just dancing around the edges. And so we are trying to dig in deep and get to that work. And it takes time, it is hard. I would argue it is some of the hardest work you can do.
I left Legacy Media after 18 years in the summer of 2021. My last role was leading diversity, equity, and inclusion programs within a large newsroom. And that was really rewarding work. I left to join my childhood friend Mitra at URL Media because she was creating something different and a different way of doing business. And we joined together to really disrupt how hiring is done, and to your point, Martin, getting at disrupting how we hire. And so it's been really rewarding work to do it at URL, where we are in a different position of power, where we can actually engage with clients. And our clients are, employers who say to us, we want diverse candidates. We're not attracting enough diverse candidates to this position. How can you help? And one of the things that we're able to do is really challenge clients, if they want to be challenged, on what does that mean to you? How are you setting up candidates of color for success? Because we are about the we approach candidates from a place of affirmation, and we want to make sure that we're placing them in a workplace that's going to uplift, respect, and love all of their experience, and make sure that they're creating a system where this person can succeed and thrive. So we're not just placing people for the sake of diversity, and that's a really different way of working. And with some clients, it works, and with the clients that we figure out, like, yeah, this is a check the box exercise for you, we're pretty open and transparent about that, and we are likely not to work with them again if they are not really genuine about their desire to create an ecosystem within and an ethos in their workplace where people of color can succeed and thrive.
So what are you looking for when you want to say this organization is doing more than just checking a box?
We go through a series of intake conversations with our clients about the ethos of their organization. And it's a partnership. So we're meeting with them as we're trying to lay out a list of candidates. We are meeting with them very frequently, asking a lot of probing questions. I put my journalism hat on because a lot of this is about really interrogating. So when someone says, we really want someone who's going to push the envelope, I'm like, okay, let's unpack that. What do you really mean by that? Because pushing the envelope for me means really holding truth to power. And is that what it looks like in your organization? You'd be surprised. Some people are like, ooh, yeah, no, that's not what I meant. What I meant was, yeah. I'm like, are they really going to be able to challenge the CEO? Are they really, that's how I think about it. And so it's really eye-opening for the client and for us. And through a series of conversations, we get there. There's also actions, like we had one client, which we talked about, and that will remain nameless, where we had presented a slate of candidates of color. This woman of color got through to the very end, and at the end of the process, this client came to us and said, well, we want to offer her a job, not the top job, but lessening the offer and giving her a kind of step ladder to the next role. And we pushed back on that. We said that is not okay. That is, and we parted ways with this client. And we're okay to step away from a relationship like that because it doesn't serve our mission. It doesn't serve it doesn't serve our candidates, and it doesn't serve our goal to really truly diversify newsrooms.
I think that's amazing that you walk away. You spoke about your legacy media career. Mitra also spent however many years at CNN before she started this organization. So the two of you and others that you work with were able to really build agency and experience through these legacy media companies. And I just want to hear you talk a little bit about how that allows you to now say no. Because I know probably earlier in your career you were not comfortable saying that.
Very true. We came up at a very different time. And it's that ability to say no that drew me to, I've never worked at a startup. It was a chance I took. It is exhilarating to be in that position. Have not always been in that position. It's hard, though. It is hard work because we leave money on the table. And, we are a for-profit company, which sometimes companies will come to us and say, you're a BIPOC-owned, people of color-led organization. You must be a nonprofit. So there's a lot of work we're doing to educate people. We are unapologetically capitalist and for-profit. And we need to make money to support our network partners too, and help them create an ecosystem within the journalism space that helps Black and Brown-owned media thrive. So we are, at least in the recruitment division, we're always walking that fine line. But what I love about working with Mitra and all of the URL crew is that we know where our North Star is, and our North Star is uplifting, respecting, and loving the experiences of our candidates, and also through the network of our network partners. So we always go back to that, and that gives us the ability to say no, even if it does hurt our bottom line.
Right. Okay, Kathleen. For those of you who may not know, you were meant to be at Texas A&M right now. Somehow, you are still at UT Austin. If you don't know the story, what I'll say is Google her. What can you offer with that perspective?
I've studied newsroom practices for a very, very long time, and I never expected that I would be my own case study. So it's very weird when someone says, "Oh, I saw you interviewed on," no, I never talked to those people. I don't know what you're talking about. But there were a lot of stories. So now I'm on the other side of seeing media, and I got extraordinarily positive reporting and positive commentary, which I'll never forget. But it's a little bit like Waking Ned Devine, if you've ever seen that movie, where I won't give you the plot point, but you'll know that part. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. To hear people say wonderful things about you, and it's like, no, y'all don't know me. I just had a hissy fit on the tennis court. That's not Kathleen. But I will say, in terms of newsrooms, in 1955, I might get the year wrong, Warren Breed did a study of journalists, of newspapers. And he really broke down how culture rules newsrooms. Now, this had nothing to do with diversity. It had only to do with newspapers, because that's all he studied. But if you look at it, 1955, everything he said pretty much holds true about newsrooms. Certain people always end up on A1. Certain people never end up on A1. Certain people get to break the rules. Certain people don't. So one of the things about the Center for Ethical Leadership in Media is we're saying that DEI is part of the same problem of sexual harassment, part of toxic newsrooms, part of all this type of stuff, that this is a part of newsrooms who could be better managed. I'm not saying they're not great managers. There are so many great managers out there. But is there a way that we can articulate what leadership could look like in a newsroom? And I say this as a person who got, again, very positive coverage, but I can't lose sight of the fact that I have students who come to me crying at 19, complaining about the same things that happened to me when I was a 19-year-old intern. That hasn't changed. That is like, what is wrong with that? So, and I also wonder, why me? I mean, on my badge, I still have an Evan button. We cannot forget Evan. And we cannot forget the people we don't even know what their names are. And that's the tough part. But I think if newsrooms can think about beyond people of privilege and connections like me, how do we uncover those stories and have a more complete newsroom by embracing the unseen, which is hard. That is very hard. But how do we get people to tell us their stories? And I think improving the way newsrooms are run so young people and people of color and people who are from non-elite schools and people who went to community colleges can feel as if they can have a place at the table to help us find those stories. So I know that was a long answer, and I apologize.
No, I appreciate you calling that out, because early in my career, there were times when I was the only non-white person in the room, the only woman of color, but also the only person who did not go to an Ivy League school, because that is very much also an issue. Now, in your personal case, your case is now settled, but there is an element of your situation because of a new law in Texas that is supposed to go into effect in January, banning DEI programs, but it's basically already in effect.
Yeah, it's really complicated, and I am not a legal expert, so if what I'm saying is wrong, feel free to correct me. I will not take offense. But DEI offices are not allowed in public universities. Supposedly, research and educational work is still protected, and student organizations should still be protected. But in many places, people who were associate deans of DEI will have to figure out what that means. And that became, it seems as if all the things related to DEI are now sort of, hey, what's going on? And it's all part of that basket. So, and DEI is often a shortcut just to say a person of color or a person with an identity marker. So that's how it all sort of gets woven together.
So there is this real backlash against DEI because I think, again, after 2020, the racial justice protests, we dared to start naming the systems, right? Systemic racism is an issue. White patriarchy is an issue. White supremacy affects every industry. Martin, this is something we've talked a lot about. So tell me your perspective, again, having worked in this space for so long, at seeing both the cultural backlash, rhetorical backlash, but then it's manifesting in laws in Texas and Florida.
Yeah, and manifesting in a class action lawsuit that 5 current and former Gannett employees just filed against the company, citing discrimination against non-people of color. And we are seeing these responses, attacks on corporate DEI programs. And I have, like I said in our prep call, that I have sort of this burning rage around this issue, that we have this one moment where we push and propel things forward. And then the minute that happens, and then this SCOTUS decision occurs, and then these chilling effects that emerge as a result of that, coupled with the financial issues and some concerns on the part of newsrooms. So we've seen a real slowing in the desire on the part of news organizations to have more training, to keep building on the work that they had done. We convened a group of newly minted DEI editors who had been hired during that period of time. And it was all women of color, mostly black women. Interesting that the folks who are often called on to clean up the messes, as Kathleen was saying, are women of color and particularly black women. And so then all of a sudden, what happens to those positions? Where are the support for them? The other part is there's also been a shift in gaze in philanthropy. Philanthropy was responded incredibly powerfully to 2020, but then as those fires burn in other parts of the horizon, that gaze shifts. And what I'm looking to, and there's focus on obviously local news, but we've also had program officers ask the question, well, what do, and as the shift to threats to democracy has emerged, and they asked us, well, what does diversity have to do with a threat to democracy? And I'm just looking at them like, how am I supposed to answer that question? And it's very
If you have to ask the question, then
yeah. So that's not everyone, but there are program officers that are asking that. And then there's the part, what we're hearing is that there's sort of conversations around, they're having conversations with attorneys and making sure that language is appropriate. I'm like, that's not the posture folks with billions of dollars of corpuses should be taking against this institutional and structural attack that we are seeing. You need to lead. Smaller nonprofits like the Maynard Institute and many others, affinity groups who are doing this and been pushing for this for so long, we're the ones who could be attacked and could be wiped out as a result of these lawsuits. You all have the power, the influence, the capacity in legal teams to affect this change, and you have an obligation to do so and speak to it. And that's a little uncomfortable for an executive director of a nonprofit to say, but I'm going to say it.
Yes, a round of applause for that, absolutely. I was glad that you mentioned the lawsuit because I didn't know about this at first, and I don't know if it is widely known, but they are actually suing for alleged reverse discrimination.
Correct.
Because they're not people of color.
Right.
Fascinating.
It's enough to make you go quiet in front of many people.
You know, I do want to say one of the reasons why I chose the word I said in the beginning, though I can't pronounce it, is because the Hutchins Commission in the 40s slightly addressed race in newsrooms. There's a line in there about, comics and quote unquote colored people, okay? And then, of course, we ended up with the Kerner Commission in '68 after all the riots. And the only chapter people talk about is the chapter on journalism, by the way. You know, sorry about that, my watch goes off at noon every day. But there are all these other chapters, but, you know, we journalists only talk about the one on newsrooms, and, you know, part of it is white reporters were being beaten up during the riots, okay? Let's hire some black folk and some brown folk. And now we're talking about this, and we're still gonna be there, but people are gonna try to come up with, like, if DEI is being attacked, it's because in some little tiny bit way, and it's just tiny, it's working. So that's why I am less worried about the expression and just knowing that we will figure something out, you know, just because the sheer numbers of us. But again, how can you empower? There's a great line in Juneteenth, and then I will shut up, the book Juneteenth, when these black people go into the office of a senator, and they say, we are among the counted but not heard. Yeah. So how can we make people not only counted, but heard?
Now, have you seen a similar backtracking of some of these promises or funds or pledges for hiring in your work?
Absolutely. We did really well in 2021, 22. This year, we've seen a lot less interest in how we do business and how we approach hiring. And it has a lot to do with this retrenchment of commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And because we also strongly believe in holding people to account for, you know, using or trying to use diversity as a buzzword. I think, you know, that folks are a little bit like, well, we don't need that anymore. We've got it solved. And I want to bring up something you both talked about is the power, right? We did see a lot of appointments of women of color and black women to different positions within newsrooms, but were they given the power to make changes? Did they have the support to really do the work that they were hired to do? And, you know, I would venture to say, and just from my, you know, conversations off the record with a lot of these women, no. And that's really, you know, gets at the heart of the problem. Like, you can appoint people into leadership roles, but are you giving them the power to do the job you said they were employed to do? And that's still not changing, and that hasn't shifted. And if you have one woman of color at the top, how much power do they have to lift as they climb, right? And then are they the person that's just bringing, you know, oh, you're just bringing this person because they look like you or sound like you? Well, you know, people have before us have been doing that, and no one said anything.
No, what you're saying, I mean, if you do research, or I know you all know the expression double bind. So if you're a woman, by the way, the term bossy only applies to women. No man is ever called bossy, okay? But to her point, if you have the responsibility and none of the authority, we've all been in that position, right? So that's why I look at newsrooms as a whole as a workplace. And anyone who's won, you know, just because you win awards or just because you brought down something doesn't mean that maybe you're the best manager. And newsrooms haven't always operated that way. So all the things you're talking about.
Now, Martin, you mentioned the burning rage. We've also called it the quiet rage. The burden on people of color in their newsrooms and in the industry as a whole to bring up these conversations and constantly have them and constantly be asked to prove yourself and then be put in these positions but not given the resources or the power. It is absolutely exhausting. Talk to me a little bit about that mental toll, and also what is it that keeps you going in the work that you're doing?
Well, I'd say that what keeps me going in the work is is programs like Maynard 200 that we offer at the Institute, where we're training the next generation of journalism entrepreneurs, mid-level managers and editors, executive leaders, and storytellers. And at last year's graduation at USC, we asked the fellows upon graduation to describe one word to explain their experience during the fellowship. And they organically started to respond as to how they were feeling when they arrived. And these are 4 tracks of learning. They get a bunch of training, they get support, they get a mentor, there's work in between 2 in-person weeks of training. But what they said, we're talking about being unseen, unheard, undervalued, considering leaving journalism. And these are incredibly smart, thoughtful, bright minds of different generations and of different ethnicities and races and classes and genders, and who need to be in the profession. And then to hear them say, after being together, learning from a diverse faculty, what they got, and most importantly, building community, and for them to be saying the inverse of that, that they are now seen, they feel valued, they feel heard, they feel supported. That's the work that inspires me and inspires the Maynard team. My co-executive director, Evelyn Sue, is here, who is the architect of that, and our director, Odette Keeley, is also here, and they just do amazing work supporting these folks. But the reality is these folks come in feeling this sense of imposter syndrome. They're going into places where it is hostile, but it's also part of the reason that we have a track for entrepreneurs. Because when we designed Maynard 200, we understood that we couldn't continue to funnel people into many of these toxic newsrooms, and we needed to support folks who are going to remake media. And so that's incredibly inspiring as well.
For me personally, I have found great, I've been centered by the candidates that we work with. I have the great gift of hearing directly from them that I've changed the course of their career or how they think about the interview process. We do a lot of coaching of our candidates along the way, and that's all free. And so, even if they don't get the job at the end, I have heard just so many stories about how, wow, no one's ever said that to me. No one's ever been as sometimes, I'm very direct in a good, loving way. But hearing that I am able to help someone reframe how they're viewed, how to talk about their experience, how to package their experiences and life skills and present those in a way that really resonate, is very powerful. So that's what keeps me going. And then the other simmering rage that we talk about is that a lot of our folks are leaving the industry in droves, or they're being laid off. I mean, all the layoffs we've seen. I mean, we saw this in 2008. We're seeing it now. That also drives me because we need to stay in this business. And so how do we create an ecosystem that pays people a living wage, that they can still do this work, feel valued and respected for the perspective they bring to the newsroom? It is still at the core of what brings me and inspires me to continue to do the work that we do. Because it is important that we stay in this field. Our stories are still, haven't been told. It's an unfinished story. And, also I think you both brought up this idea of journalists just come from these ivory towers and perches. I've seen that, and there is a way of talking about and reporting about our communities, and then there's a way to do it with authenticity that I think only we can do, and only we can really bring those stories to light. And so I want to see us just continue this work because of that. We need to be in these seats.
Well, my thing is the 19-year-old wants to work for the New York Times and hasn't read a story yet. Or, this idea, this notion. I want that person in that beginning reporting class, I want to see them 5 years from now. I want to see them 10 years from now when they're leaders. And our curriculum is, right now, is mostly designed for students because we've done the work that our center used to be called Press Forward. And there was work that we did with McKinsey that showed that people of color and women enter the media workplace about 50%, but as the leadership pipeline goes, it shrinks to maybe 2% or 3%. I'm making up, it's very, very small. So my thing is, I want that student to, if you want to work in a newsroom, then I want you to have all the chances of doing that. And I want you to feel like a couple of years into it that this is something I want to do, and I am supported. I have a living wage. There is an online harassment policy. There are all these things that go into it. So that's why this center and this curriculum are important for me, because the students today who are majoring in journalism are fighting culture. They're fighting their parents. They're fighting a lot of things for a profession that needs to give them as much love back somehow. So that's why I still feel like there's a future.
So in that vein, yes. In that vein, what is your advice to young journalists who want to advocate for inclusivity and equity in their newsrooms, but they don't yet have those leadership roles?
So I think, and maybe because of certain states we're in or certain words, I'm going to go to your word belonging, or how can I talk to my leadership in a way that my leadership hears me? Sometimes you don't even want a solution. You just want to be heard, right? So what are the mechanisms you can put into your newsroom? How can you talk to your immediate boss, or what's out there? What's the quote unquote, a lot of things that are listed as training aren't really training. It's just you need to get up close and personal with the people who are running your life. So I think it's helping people, and that's what we're trying to do with our curriculum, how you navigate. So to me, again, DEI is one part of what we need to make newsrooms functional. Because if you have a better newsroom, to me, you have better content.
Plus one to that, and I would say finding community, like find your tribe, find people that, yes, are going to hear you when you just need to rant and complain because everything is awful, but people that are also going to help you lift yourself from that and figure out solutions and ways forward, because we all need the, to your point, we need to figure out, like, how do we talk to that boss? So surround yourself by people that are going to help arm you with the tools to get through those tough moments, because the work is hard. Sometimes you're not paid what you should be. And so we need to do a better job of uplifting each other and being there for each other and really creating community, I would say, is my best advice to young folks, and reach out to us.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I guess what I would add to it is when we have our fellows go through Maynard 200, they one of our senior most trainers, Professor Jean Marie Brown, does the Gallup Strengths program so that they can understand where their strengths lie. Rather than focusing on the weakness, where is your superpower? And how can you double and triple down on that? And it gives them a better perspective on, number one, their own skills and capacities and abilities, but also gives them a chance to think about, well, what might be happening with other folks. Also thinking across social fault lines of race and class and gender, because how we align across these fault lines shapes our perception, and it shapes our biases, and it can explain why two people look at the same thing and come away with very different perceptions. And so if you can arm yourself with some perspective and understanding of that, it's a very powerful way in which to step into a room that can be very difficult. And one of the things that we're seeing happening is generation is a huge fault line, tension point in news organizations, as we have four adult generations often in newsrooms, boomers, Gen Xers, which are clearly the best generation, And then and then we have millennials, which represent the largest group, and then we have Gen Z. And I think Gen Z and millennials have a real different desire in how to be managed, and it goes from sort of this notion of boss to coach, this notion of my career to my life. And so I think that actually is really good for journalism, because those of us who came up before, it was like get there early and stay late, and they're like, oh, I'm not staying late.
No.
I need to go, and why am I not promoted? And I should be making more money. So, and I think there's some good lessons in that, but also the younger folks need to have a little grace as well, and understand that they have different generations that were shaped in different ways and have their own things to bring and that they can learn from.
But I will say the burden, and I know it's going to be time for Q&A, I think the burden often, though, does fall on the youngest generation in the newsroom, that there is this sort of acquiescing. And it's also, I think the one thing I would say to everybody in this room is that you are not alone. Mm-hmm. People will try to gaslight you. Yes. People will isolate you. And you've got to, and it's hard because we all have imposter. I'm 64 years old and I have imposter syndrome. So I think that's the thing to realize, is that there are things that are happening to you that have nothing to do with you.
Yes.
And I know that's a very difficult thing to unpack, but that's one thing I would say to young people.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly that to your point about the generational differences, we're all always learning, and on my team, Sonali Kohli teaches me things every single day, and I am grateful to be on the receiving end of that mentorship from her. She's not here, but shout out to her, because she is just amazing. And I think that's a lesson for us as we get older, that we are always learning, and to really embrace that generational difference. And it's something that I bring to my work when I talk to clients, and trying to help them navigate those shifts is really, really important.
All right, I think we have some audience questions to get to.
Sure. Actually, we don't have any right now, but I will allow them. If you have questions in the room, you have questions on the stream, please submit those now through the link that's in the session description. But I do have a question for you all, which is, when you're thinking about this upcoming presidential election and all the things that we've talked about, what do you think about how newsrooms and news organizations are viewing the lens of the whole fabric of the United States, and how they're allocating their resources? Do you think that they're preparing in the right ways? What advice would you give them? What sort of, what are the main things that you think will come up this year that might be the same as they always have been, or that might be quite different this year?
One of the things I would say is that national politics has sucked the oxygen out of our culture in so many ways. And, when we talk about news deserts, and I know Richard Watts is here, and he's for the Center for Community Journalism and Community News, and one of the things we talk about is that when local news goes away, the national conversation dominates that community, as opposed to schools or roads or the hospital. So your point is well taken, Kelsey, but I think that, national politics will take up as much air as you allow it to. And a lot of the things that are going on have happened at the state level. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a time for a kind of reassessment, if you're not a national organization, how you sort of proportionalize what you're giving oxygen to.
I think that's such a great point. And I think that, that's one of the reasons I'm heartened by the efforts on the part of philanthropy to support and infuse local news with major investments. I think it's so critical, because the organization that I used to work for, the Oakland Tribune, where I was the managing editor and editor-in-chief, the amount of reporting capacity that we once have, there's literally one reporter covering Oakland. Thankfully now Oakland side is there doing a great job, and I'm on the board, so I just want to recognize that. But the level of capacity to focus on the stories that are happening every day in communities is so essential. And I think what frustrates me when I look at the national news is they could actually cover something else than Trump. There are many other issues that these organizations could be putting a lens to that are connected to the presidential election and have to do with the issues that would make people's lives better. And I don't understand it when there's all this criticism of this individual, and yet you can't quit him. So why don't you just quit him? Yeah, and I understand it's ratings, and it's one of the reasons why I think that for-profit journalism is problematic. I feel like there are 7 to 8 things in our society that should be about unbridled profit: healthcare, housing, music, art, culture, prisons, transportation, food, and journalism. And if we had a world where those 7 things were not about unbridled profit, think about how different things would be.
If I can, I do want to say one thing to that, though, that there's so much journalism that is still for profit, and I worry that a lot of emphasis is on startups, and it's almost like, and I know this is something that Duck at Night and other people are we've discussed, is we can't wait till something becomes a desert to try to fix it. And in a lot of those places, though they're for profits, they're not making a whole lot of money, maybe more than what you think. But so that's the thing I do worry about.
Well, also, I think you don't want to then, and I think Sarah Lomax-Rees talks about this, like, you don't want to all of a sudden eliminate the opportunity for folks of color to start a for-profit venture either, right? So now, we got to go all nonprofit.
Exactly.
And so I think it's complicated.
It is complicated. And having worked at a national news organization for a really long time, I will say that what happens a lot is we'll parachute in to these local communities not really understanding the local flavor and politics, and that's a problematic model. And there is a way for national news and local news to partner better without national coming in and saying, we are smarter, we are stronger, we have more resources, which the resource, undoubtedly, yes, you may have a lot more resources, but how do you use that to create and coalesce a stronger partnership with your local markets? Because there, even in broadcast, like, local news is not doing well. And so how do you create more solid partnerships so that, to your point, you are really reporting on the issues that matter to those communities? And I'm not sure that National's getting that. They're not getting that message, that they really need to go beyond the ratings, beyond the, Trump just walked to the Rose Garden, let's get our cameras there. I mean, there is this, pack journalism mentality that still pervades national media. And so it's how do we bring those bigger for-profit companies into this conversation? Because it does feel like it's us versus them, and now being on this side of things.
I think national and legacy media still have a lot to learn from 2016 and 2020 that I hope is applied next year, but we'll see. I'll give some credit to CNN, because I was watching the coverage last night of Trump arriving at the Fulton County Jail, and he did make remarks after he left before he got on the plane, and CNN very explicitly was like, we're not going to carry this live. If he actually says something that's newsworthy, we'll let you know, but we're not carrying this live. It's a difference. Yeah. It's a small steps. Exactly. Small steps.
And we're having to teach young people how to find legitimate voices, and I think this is getting away from everybody being quoted. It's like, they'll ask, how many sources? 7. And no, it's like, what are the voices that really help you tell an accurate story? And maybe that's one way I think less about you must have DEI voices. Which voices are going to give you the most well-rounded, accurate, fully dimensional story? And when you put it in those terms, it sort of helps them, build a circle. Oh, I need this voice, but this is a good counter. So I think that's, it doesn't have to be the same 6 people being quoted in every story.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I think we do have an audience question.
We absolutely do. This one's from Maya Nabanka at AJ+.
How does the siloing or redlining of news at legacy organizations, i.e. black verticals, queer verticals, etc., contribute to failure of news organizations to successfully integrate their coverage and their newsrooms?
Great question. We were just talking about this earlier, yes.
Thank you for the question. Yes, it is challenging. In my last organization, we had verticals that were Latino, Black, queer, all of the verticals. I want to create space and say that those verticals do really incredible journalism, work that is not being done in the mainstream media, and I use that in quotes. It has siloed how we cover communities of color and marginalized communities. And it's not a conversation that's lost on leadership. It's because we, having been part of the system, bring that up. Like, there were times I pitched stories with Latino characters that was said to me, well, why don't you pitch that to the Latino vertical? Because that's where that story belongs. And so it took me and a lot of other employees pushing back on that to say, I don't understand why the story on education that happens to feature a Latino character cannot be on the evening news tonight, and needs to just be put into this vertical. So what I would say is, if you're in that situation, use your voice to really highlight to folks in power and leadership, and that make these editorial decisions, that or question it if you can. And it's not always possible in every organization. We know that some leaders do not like to be questioned, and that's not leadership necessarily. So it's really hard. I say that understanding that there are politics involved. It is problematic. It is challenging. But I don't want to negate the work that some of these verticals are doing, because they're doing really great journalism. And it's really, I think more of us need to say, like, these stories are America's stories. They are everyone's stories, and need a bigger marketing budgets. They need to be also the A1, to use an old term. Like, sometimes they have really great reporting that just doesn't surface and is not amplified in the same way.
Or if it's on the homepage at 3 a.m., that does not count.
Yes. And so that's the other challenge with creating these siloed verticals. It's not getting the same attention and love that other stories are getting.
And I want to quickly add that journalism research has the same issue. The Howard Journal of Communication is a great journal. It cannot run every piece on journalism research. And I think it's on certain organizations within journalism research to not say everything has to go to the minority division,
right,
or to this division, that it's important that this research is spread out all over the publications.
Right. And I think the other way to think about it too is, like, are you just checking a box by having these verticals, right? Like, why do you have them if you're not going to celebrate and, like, amplify their work, and it's still just being read by us?
And Kelsey mentioned this earlier, but there is a business case as well, right? Aside from editorial, you can actually make a business case for reaching these audiences and broader audiences.
Absolutely. I mean, you just look at entertainment, right? The movies like Black Panther broke records. Like, you just can look to movies that were made featuring all Black casts, all Latino casts, like, well, more all Black casts.
Or women in
lead. Have that Latino breakout film,
yeah,
but
or women in lead roles.
Yeah.
Those also do well.
Yeah.
And I would just say, though, the thing is, if you tell these stories, they don't all have to be, and I'm just learning these expressions, deficit-based.
Yes.
They don't have to be about pathology. I did a study on stories about gunshot victims. It's funny, I was talking to someone about that this morning, and instead of saying Black people, this story, which was based in Philadelphia but was in a different publication, used names like LaShikra and Lawan. And so there were all these code words to say, ooh, these are about Black people getting shot. So that's the other end of that. How do you tell these stories that aren't going back to Moynihan?
Right. Right.
Do you have one more, or yes?
We have probably time for just one more question, and this needs to be probably pretty brief, which is, What do you think the effect is of unions right now on these efforts? And are there any examples of unions doing this work well? And that's from Jean Son at Resolve Philly.
I think you said the word unions on this work. I think that that's not a bad thing. I think it's a good thing, but this is just me talking as an individual. I mean, unions existed for a reason. They came about for a reason. And if they make newsrooms stronger, then I think that I personally, again, I'm not talking the position of the University of Texas at Austin, but I think there's a reason why unions were invented, and there's a reason why unions exist.
And I think we're seeing unions emerge also in the nonprofit journalism space as well. I worked for a company that constantly had an antagonistic relationship with the bargaining unit. And so what I've been heartened by is to see some nonprofit news organizations actually voluntarily recognize the efforts on the part of their workers to unionize. And I think it doesn't inherently have to be, I guess it's a bit of an adversarial relationship, but it doesn't have to be volatile.
Or hostile.
Or hostile.
Okay, very briefly, because we do need to wrap up. What do you want people to take away from this conversation back to their newsrooms?
I would just like for you all to take back to your newsroom an understanding that we all have our work to do, and that belonging is for all of us, in service of the journalism that we want to do, but most importantly, in service of the communities that need each and every one of you. And I want you to take back some hope and a little bit of rage and a little bit of willingness to fight and to say what's important and to think about collective action. I can't believe as a journalist I'm saying collective action. But the reality is we have to think of it that way. It's why we formed ONA with ONA and Open News, the Vision 25 partnership, because we need help to amplify this work because the forces are pushing back against it.
I co-sign all of that, and I will add that if you, to use a really New York cliche, if you see something, say something. Find people that are going to back you up. You're not alone. If you're feeling like there is something that can change within your organization, guaranteed there are others like you in that organization. Seek them out. Seek us out. We're an advocate. We're here to help. We're allies. You need career advice, my email is open. So please look us up. Push your employers to actually hire well and hire holistically, and they can call us as well if they want to have that conversation in an open, transparent way. We're here for that conversation.
And I would say if you're a leader, are you practicing radical listening? Are you really listening? And does everyone in your newsroom feel safe emotionally, physically, and in terms of their career? Do people feel safe enough to tell you something that could make them do their job better? If they don't feel that safe, then I think you have more work to do as a leader.
Okay, Kathleen, Lenore, Martin, thank you so much for your contributions to this conversation.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.